Good evening, one and all, and welcome to today's webinar on the profession ahead. The webinar is also streaming live on our Facebook page, Admissions at DY Patil University, Pune. I, Architect Neha Sagam, on behalf of DY Patil University, School of Architecture, Ambi, welcome our guest speaker for today, Architect Anupama Kundu and Architect Prem Chandavarkar sir, our Honorable Vice Chancellor Ma'am, Dr. Saili Ganekar, Principal of School of Architecture, Dr. Uma Jadhav Ma'am, Professor in Design Chair, Dr. Ravindra Deshmukh sir, and all the participants present here today. Before we proceed further for the webinar, I would like to screen a small video by introducing you all to DY Patil University.
Global exposure. We offer a blend of traditional and contemporary teaching methodology, which includes virtual sessions, case conclaves, workshops, seminars, advanced laboratories for practicals, industrial visits, and a trainers who guide our students and encourage them. They are highly
At 29 and I find myself wondering what did happen to the last 10. I ran away with my life, fast forward, never turn back again. It's kind of funny that the more we pass time, the more we need to set the rewind. And 19 was the year I had to leave you, but now I'm seeing all the signs. Is this really happening? I can't believe it's true. I'm just as surprised as you. Is this really happening?
As we now commence with our webinar, it gives me a great pleasure to introduce you all to our convener for today, Dr. Ravindra Deshmukh sir. Ravindra Deshmukh sir graduated from VRCE Nagpur, did his post-graduation from University of Roorkee and PhD from Manipal University. He has a vast experience of 10 years in design and construction and more than 35 years in teaching and research. He has also been a Fulbright scholar with North Dakota State University, USA. Along with presenting a number of research papers, he has also published them in the reputed international and national journals. After serving for about 22 years, he retired as the Dean at Manipal University and is currently working as Professor in Design Chair at DY Patil University, School of Architecture, Ambi. I now request Dr. Ravindra Deshmukh sir to kindly proceed with the session and the formal introduction of our guests.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Neha. I would like to now introduce to you our two very prominent personalities, luminaries of this webinar. Prem Chandavarkar. Prem Chandavarkar is the Managing Director of C&T. C&T is the first architectural practice in Bangalore. He did his architecture in 1978 from School of Planning and Architecture in New Delhi. Thereafter, he worked with Kanvinay Rai Chaudhary for about 2 years. Then he went to University of Oregon for further studies, where he finished his MArch. Erstwhile, Chandavarkar and Thakur. Now it is C&T. The firm has wide range of projects from residential, institutional, industrial, corporate, hospitality to urban master plans and interiors. Some choicest projects of CNT are A.O. Smith Factory. A.O. Smith is a very well-known name in the field of electrical gadgets. Their geysers are very famous. So that factory is designed by CNT. Otis Factory, Aurobindo Pharma. Aurobindo Pharma is a name in pharmaceutical industries. So their office at Hyderabad, Sri Lanka Telecom headquarters in Colombo, Indian Institute of Management at Trichy. These are only a few projects of CNT architecture firm from Bengaluru. There are many more projects. If you visit the website, you will come to know that they have wide range of projects there. So with this introduction, now I request Prem to unfold the profession ahead through his slide presentation. So over to you, Prem.
Okay, thank you for inviting me here. And I shall just open my slide presentation. Okay, I assume you can see the screen now?
Yeah.
Okay. So to talk about the profession ahead, we have to first acknowledge our history. And I have to explain that the practice I run is, unlike most architects, is not a practice founded by me. It goes back to an earlier generation. So that's the current name of the practice, but it dates back to a firm that was Bangalore's first architectural firm in 1950, which was then restructured in 1963 after the death of the founding partner. In 1982, a second generation started appearing in the firm, and that generation was in place in 1986 when I joined the firm. And we started running the firm since the late 80s onwards. In 2003, the founding generation retired. And then we found once we were the second generation, once we were looking at our own direction, we found that we had different ideas. So there was an amicable parting of the ways. And it's actually since 2004, I have had sole control of the firm and have been running it. Otherwise, it's always been part of a larger collective. And a lot of people say to me, you had a ready-made firm handed to you, you have it easy. And I didn't find that easy. And I think one of the reasons is that when you start your own firm, you can indulge your own desire. But when you're continuing a legacy, you always feel an obligation that you have to serve something that is greater than yourself. So yes, in some ways it's easy, but in some ways it is more difficult. And I started looking at what in 2004 started evaluating that history of what the firm came from. And if you look at what most Indian architects were doing in the 1950s, 1960s when the firm established itself, Chandigarh was this hugely influential symbol of what India's modern architecture should be. And the first generation of architects was very heavily influenced by that Corbusian idiom. But I found something very different in what was Chandavakar and Thakur then, or CNT now. The preoccupation was not about making these architectural symbols. And it was what I call the architecture of the background, where the preoccupation was to earn the respect of the community within which you practice by the architecture you produce. So that affected us. So we started looking very much at this whole idea of what a practice is. And we often speak about the practice that is not personality centric. And we came up with the idea of a collaborative practice. So it's not personality centric. There are multiple teams. So it's not that everything in this office is designed by me. I'm more like the designer of a design environment. And we are actually 6 teams, one other principal who helped me in the practice management. So it's like a collective of 6 offices under one roof. So whatever work we produce doesn't come from a single voice or a small set. It comes from a multitude. And within each of these teams also, there's a fair degree of democracy where even the junior most architect is totally free to suggest what should be done on a project. So totally these 6 teams make up about 60 people, and that's who we are. So we came up with this idea that the practice is actually a place. It's not a vehicle for individual expression. It's a place where a certain kind of thing happens. So we have a community that makes up the place, and each member of that community, they're the players in this place, and each of them has a quest where they're searching for meaning and purpose in their life, looking for what good architecture is. And then these players take actions, and the major action that keeps the place going really is the projects. But we actually have some organized discussion forums where we exchange ideas. Every Monday there's a sharing of work. There are many other forums, and we also have research that goes on. And then these actions leave traces, and the major trace is actually just the work, which should speak for itself without commentary, the record of the work. But there are also positions that we develop and document on certain issues or certain building types. And then that eventually leads to philosophy. And the philosophy, we say, is a beacon. It's not that it drives everything we do. It's something we keep. It's like when you're rowing a boat, you turn your back to where you're going, but every now and then you turn around, take sight of a beacon and adjust your course. So that's the way we look at the philosophy, where the philosophy critiques the practice critiques the philosophy. So there's a back and forth movement across these layers. And the idea, the methodology that drives all projects is a connection between two terms we call the proposition and the diagram. And we have very specific interpretations of what these terms mean. The proposition is an aspirational and poetic notion about life that's specific to the inhabitation of the project. So it's about life, it's not about architecture. We try and connect with the fact that we're human beings before we are architects. And the diagram is about the autonomy of architecture as a discipline. It's about our specific skills. And so it's an architectural order that we develop, which captures the proposition in a manner that is meaningful to the inhabitant. And what we look at is how the two come together into a whole that is greater than the sum of the parts. So I'll show one case study project to explain what I mean, and then I'll end with some reflections looking ahead. So this project is a 20-acre campus in Bhubaneswar for a software company called Mindtree. They call this Mindtree Kalinga. A large part of it was a centralized training center for up to 1,000 trainees at a time. Everyone who joins the company goes there for at least 2 to 3 months of training, but even senior employees come for refresher courses. Then you needed residential accommodation for the trainees, and then 2 software offices with about 2,000 people in each. So the proposition came from the fact that this was actually a community of learners, a community of workers. And how did that interface with the notions of nature and life on the site? So the diagram we came up with was, there was a hill which was a protected landscape to the east, and there was a reserve forest which was a protected landscape to the west. So these were tremendous assets the site had. So we said there's a path of life which connects the sunrise and the sunset. And we said we'll have a landscape sequence where you first come into a security building, then you move down a promenade, then you come to a centralized plaza and amphitheater, and then you come to another reflecting point, and then you come to the point where actually you see the sunset. As soon as you come into one side is the learning center here, and the other side is a social center, and these are the 2 software blocks. There's a large pond, rainwater harvesting pond, since Bhubaneswar had periods of intense rainfall. So we wanted to make the campus self-sufficient in water. So the diagram was really, you had this path of life which connected the sunrise and the sunset, and then what we call the street of friendship and ideas, which went through the heart of the social center, which is the residential block, connected with the entrance to the learning center, went along the edge of either software block, along the edge of the water body, and looped back. So it was these 2 loops which connected, which would give life to the campus. And we always look at the meaning of a campus coming from the patterns of inhabitation or meaning of any project, and how do you structure the spaces so that that inhabitation becomes meaningful. So the upper image is that rainwater harvesting body we dug, and we got a lot of earth from there. So we also made a plant for making bricks out of that mud. So all the walls in the campus are built out of stabilized soil blocks. So the upper slide is the main security block when you first enter, and this is the promenade that's taking you along the path of life. And then you come to this plaza where the main reception is, and here you're looking back at the hill behind which the sun rises. And we brought in the inhabitants of a home that the missionaries of charity run in Bhubaneswar for people who are suffering from leprosy. And they came and they did this wonderful mosaic paving in the to mark this plaza. The whole project is not constructed. The learning center and one part of the social center are constructed. One software block is just nearing completion. The second software block is still to come up. And on this path of life, we have just made the plaza, the amphitheater, and the park beyond are still to be executed. So this is once you come to the main reception and you're looking towards the social center, the residential block. This is the learning center where you have these bunches of classrooms which are around a landscaped atrium which is covered, but it is open at either end. So the breeze, it channels the breeze and through. So it's always a pleasant place to be in. So that people between classes hang around over here, because a lot of learning comes from informal interaction and not just from formal interaction. This is that main promenade where you come down. This is the reception, and this is the entrance into the learning center. And there's an amphitheater near the entrance. So that's the view of the entrance. This is that amphitheater you come to, and the amphitheater works as a social space. It works as a space for small instruction, sort of in more informal instruction. Or it can be a place where the entire community gathers, such as when the chairman of the company is visiting. And this is that landscape atrium in the center. And because it is a pleasant place, you see people hanging out between classes. Sometimes they sit there to do their project work. Sometimes they just sit there to chat. But it's always a lively place. And the classrooms, we did all the interiors also. So the furniture is all reconfigurable. So you can move it from a lecture setting to a seminar setting to working in teams. And the patterns in the carpet show the various configurations. So the students are shown how to move the furniture around for these various settings. And the tables and the chairs are all on wheels. Then there's a cafeteria at the lower ground level. This is the plan of the social center, the residential center, which has the main lobby over here, and this is that spine that runs through, which is part of the path of life. And this is a typical residential module, where this is one cluster of 4 double occupancy rooms around a common work area, and these all open off an atrium. So these are just some views from the outside of the social center, and this is as you come into the main lobby, and this is that main residential spine which connects a series of courtyards and gardens. And you have these gardens on one side, and you have social spaces like games rooms and all on the other side. So again, it is quite a buzzing place, and it is a place where people hang out and they socialize. So again, the informal learning which we created in the learning center atrium is reflected here also. We avoided air conditioning in the residential block by, on top of this atrium, we made these solar chimneys which make hot, the air heats up and starts rising and coming out of these louvers at the top. And we feed in evaporatively cooled air into each room, which then comes through louver cuts into the common area, and then through another set of louver cuts into that atrium, and that exits from the top. So no hot air is allowed to build up. So that continuous movement of air together with ceiling fans creates comfort conditions. So this is the atrium, which is the next level of socialization from the main street. This is the common work area, and that's a typical room. So that's where the air is fed in. It comes into this area through these louver cuts, and then through these louvers into the main atrium. This is the cafeteria, which is at the lower level of the learning center. And this connects to the first software block, which has an amphitheater at its center. So you get 2 axes, one which is from the amphitheater and looking out onto that main path of life. And in the other direction, there's a view from this water body which connects to a meditation terrace on the uppermost floor. So I don't have photographs of the building as built, but these are just some renders of what we visualized. Okay, so looking ahead, are we seeing the complete picture? We are in very uncertain times in the middle of a pandemic, but the pandemic itself seems so terrible that we think that's all we have to deal with, and maybe 2 years later we'll come out of it. But I think there'll never be a normal. We'll come back to this economic uncertainty, which is going to continue for a long time. And beyond that is the looming specter of climate change. I mean, the pandemic, if it's anything like the Spanish flu, which was the last pandemic a century ago, it'll last maybe 2 years. But climate change is at a time scale that's at a planetary level, and how do we deal with it? And I think the situation we're dealing with is very different from earlier. There's increasing uncertainty. We didn't have to deal with that. It certainly wasn't like that at the time I was in architecture school. The problems are huge, complex, and they're non-linear. So there's no direct relationship between input and output. So if you want someone to do something about climate change, you can't tell them, oh, you do this and that will happen, though, because they're non-linear connections. There's increasing fragility along multiple dimensions. And the problems are what are a class of problems called wicked problems. That is, it's very difficult to even define the problem because you are a part of the problem. So if you try to define it, you change the problem. So it's very difficult to say that there's a solution for this problem at a philosophical level. So the responses are that we have to see ourselves as much more than giving form to the environment. We architects will have to evolve to a strategic capability of shaping the future. To do that, we can't do it on our own. We have to learn how to build alliances with others. And we have to embrace complexity and emergence. So out of these alliances, new possibilities emerge. So it's not like you construct a philosophical theory or something like that, and that determines your action. It's actually in your alliances, in your everyday actions. From that, you uncover the new possibilities. And the problem is that this requires coming to terms with the intangible and the unmeasurable. So for example, if you're talking about climate and understanding nature, there's no clear scientific basis on which you can, or intellectual basis on which you can do that. You have to develop a sense of wonder and a sense of awe and reverence towards nature and understand that fact of the intangible and how you work towards it. So that's a drastic difference in the challenge. It's not going to come from some notion of society or some theory of architecture. So how do we come to terms with the unmeasurable? And I think Louis Kahn put it really well when he said a great building must begin with the unmeasurable, must go through measurable means when it is being designed, and in the end must be unmeasurable. So the question we face is how can we know the unmeasurable? But if you look at it, most of the things that we hold as central to the value of life are unmeasurable: love, joy, beauty, compassion, wonder, etc. And they might be unmeasurable, but within our own consciousness, we know them as reality when they live within us. When we're in wonder, when we see something beautiful, when we feel love or compassion, we know it. It's difficult to describe, but we know it. So the reality of the unmeasurable is already gifted to us, and that must be our starting point. That's what we work with. And that's the central thing of when I said building alliances, it must be based on these notions of the unmeasurable. So the journey has to begin within. It's not just mindset, but also heart set and soul set. So in our evaluation, especially in the last few months when the world has turned upside down, we've been going through some rethinking on what the overarching question is. Initially, all of us, when we came out of college, we were saying, what is architecture? And we have to come to some notion with it. The model of practice I described to you was actually a change of the overarching question. We are saying, what is my practice? So not devaluing the question of what is architecture, but you approach it through the question of what is my practice. But now we coming to the realization that there is a more important question, which is who is my friend in my practice? Because those are the only ways you'll be able to make a difference. And from that question, you access these other questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Prem. That was a very interesting, very thought-provoking presentation. We'll take up the questions and answers related to your presentation and about what the audience would like to ask you little later. Now we'll move to the next speaker. And the next one is architect Anupama Kundu. Anupama Kundu graduated from Sir J.J. School of Architecture, J.J. College of Architecture in Mumbai. Later, she did her PhD from TU Berlin in 2008, where she also taught urban management. She started her practice in Auroville in 1990. She has multifaceted experience in practice, research, and teaching. She was with Auroville Pondicherry initially. She experimented with in situ firing of the whole house in mud, like the brick is fired in a kiln. In the same manner, she experimented the whole house to be burned properly. She is passionate about material experimentation and research. Her material research to achieve architecture of low environmental impact was exhibited twice at the Venice Architecture Biennale. She is a teacher known all over the world. She taught at AA School of Architecture, London, also at Parsons New School of Architecture in New York, University of Queensland, Brisbane in Australia, Cornell University in USA, and IE Madrid, Spain. Currently, she is with Potsdam School of Architecture in Germany. And also, she is visiting professor at Yale University School of Architecture, New Haven in USA. Through her slideshow, she will take us on the journey of her architectural profession. So over to you, Anupama.
Thank you so much. I'll have to ask you maybe to bear with me with the slide sharing and hope that I can find my presentation easily. And I think it's working. Can you see it? Do you see it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
So before I start,
We can't see it as yet. We can see it now.
well, first of all, I want to thank you so much for having me here. I'm particularly happy to have reconnections with Pune because it's a city that is very dear to me because I spend all my summer holidays there. I'm born in Pune and very happy to, always keep my contact to the roots. And I want to, thank you for having me. And Prem, thank you so much for your thoughts on what you presented. I could not resonate more with everything you said, actually. And well, you will see that a lot of things he spoke are also what exactly I'm trying. The expressions could be different, but very much want to I appreciate the point you made about not feeling uncertain about what you cannot measure, because only faltu things can be measured, and then you don't have the holistic thing, but the real things which cannot be measured, they remain forgotten in today's times. But then we may not, we may have checked all the boxes, but still not create something nice, So let's feel secure in the unmeasurability of certain things where we really know from our feeling, we know it, if it's good or not, And let's, as architects, I'm very happy with all these thoughts that Prem mentioned. I will explain to you that it's called the profession ahead. So I put this words, okay, knowledge before action. This was my feeling about everything about the profession when I was watching the pace and the rapid pace in which India is being built, and I was thinking how much how much are we going to be in a sense of urgency going on adding after we have knowledge as an architect, but so many market forces, so many things test us, and we ourselves are contributing perhaps to creating the cities which we don't like. So I was very, very preoccupied about the whole profession ahead question when I graduated, and all my career, which is 30 years long, has been the result of me trying to put knowledge before action. And every day I'm walking this tightrope, and all the work that I'm going to show you has also to do with all the work that I didn't do, because I feel we have to develop a certain restraint and to not become used, though we have a knowledge as architects, that we don't land up giving action to, we give strength to some people and certain projects which we know are not going to be good for our cities and for our humanity. So I personally, this reality, I don't have to describe this Gurgaon scene everywhere, this 3 layers of, the middle line of, middle skyline of building in peripheries without guidelines. Then you see there is a aspiration for real estate, developer driven, public private partnership, glitzy buildings, etc., raising the standard. But in order to build them, there is an emerging skyline of those who cannot afford anything, even though without them we can't afford to even exist. So this troubling aspect of social segregation, in which I was growing up in Bombay, and looking at how architects in our profession are hand in hand building cities that our climatology teachers have taught us from first semester all what we shouldn't do, and we are doing it. So I didn't know how can I even in my own life walk the talk and pay my bills and live a life where I don't need to make these compromises and do what how can I save my knowledge to not do a wrong action. So that kind of situation made me drop out of the rat race of Bombay. And I'm just giving you some glimpses because in my case, I think before you ask me questions about the profession, it's very much a personal trajectory of very, very risky decisions taken, you know, living in a hut 10 years, you know, all alone in the middle of nowhere, learning how to drive a motorbike because you bought a bike, but you don't know how to even bring it home. You have to, you know, many things, you know, many choices, living with solar panels, very simple, snakes dropping from your roof, all that kind of thing. But what I tried to do, and I think what succeeded, was that I didn't want to, I find a way to preserve my idealism. I feel Indians deserve better spaces. I believe architects deserve a better profession. I believe the profession deserves a better attitude. Like we all deserve better. So I felt even if I don't do anything, I was already happy if I can manage to don't do anything, you know, and to create time where I can think and liberate myself from being collaborating with things I didn't agree with, you know. So I mean, this was the first house I built, but while I built and lived I tried to liberate myself from various things. And while I did that, and of course by that time I was very fortunate, I had already some jobs and I had a practice inside this hut. There I started taking time, and therefore I'm going to have a very big exhibition in Denmark, a solo show celebrating 30 years of my dedication to this profession. It's going to be shown there. I've called it taking time because I realized that when you have a feeling of urgency, all the more you have to slow down and take time to think. If you have to rethink, you need even more time. So I started taking time and observing how the manufacture of materials, you know, people say that my work is known for the material research. I'm actually interested in the space part of architecture. I got into the material because I realized that we are unaware of the way materials are produced and how they come from large territories in India, what kind of communities are impacted, and how when it was pre-industrial, everything was within the human scale. And there was a cycle of things between, you know, people growing the branches which they're going to cut, the casuarinas, some of it will become scaffolding, some of it will, you know, between the plantation, they're doing this and they're doing that. And there's a whole cycle of things. There's a lime is being produced in small scale. Communities are all part of that, you know, and even stone is still being hand extracted. So I kind of started noticing what I felt was wrong, and I started exploring and looking at what craftsmen and people of whichever place you go, what do they do, where are they losing their livelihood, how can I channel that into building. And so we started by producing giving potters some kind of opportunity, and to building upon works from not only Laurie Baker, also Rajendra Rupal Desai, development alternatives on one hand, but also Fry Otto, Nervi, all my engineer like strong architects with a great knowledge of engineering. So these were my influences. Of course, all the modernists as well. So I was looking for a spatial and material research that would come together through very intelligent methods, where we could not only use the right materials, that the materiality of architecture in the age of climate change is a very big issue. And I was very concerned that we should, if you do use the least material, we need to be solid in our engineering, that we can use significantly less of whichever material. So through these kind of ideas, I have produced some architecture, which I'm just browsing through pictures, and there's too much about all this in the net. I did a lot of engineered architecture, and I started using non-industrial bricks and things where I realized, for instance, that the industrial brick comes with a very big impact, and what we used to call the kacha brick, is very benign because they don't use coal to fire, they use whatever's there, they use the clay which is there. It doesn't look untidy and weak because it's badly made. It's in fact just the quality of the clay that is not optimum and the fuel which is not optimum, but perhaps it's a brick worth considering. So I started exploring how to build my idea of contemporary architecture with a very, with a lot of restraint and with also a lot of clarity between the material and the non-material of architecture. The strength, the relationship between the container and what is contained. For me, that is architecture. That is, like they say, the function of the pot lies in its nothingness. So architecture is in the space, but the container is important. Like the terracotta chai cups in Calcutta, the container is important. And so that's how I see it. This is my own house. After 10 years, when I moved out, I did all this kind of experiments. The house landed in Venice Biennale. I built it 1-to-1 on the invitation of David Chipperfield. And we did everything with the garden, and it is an unprecedented project actually. Even some of these roofs, you see, they have not been built in the normal way. There is solid research going on. We are recycling glass bottles from wine. This is that project Ravindra mentioned about baking earth houses in situ, based on my PhD and also on following up with interest of the work of Ray Meeker, who pioneered this method. So we are building large-scale mud houses, cooking bricks in them, and the house itself. It's a way of looking at housing as a producer rather than consumer of energy, and also looking at the socio-economic impact of things when you bring the bricks, you bring the fire to the building site, as opposed to taking so many bricks to an industry to cook them, to make it waterproof. And also, of course, you don't need cement because fire is the cement. So I've been doing quite radical experiments. These are also, since it was a home for homeless children, there's not much money. So I'm often exploring whatever material is there, even if it comes from the waste, and urban waste is one of, we are considering it as a building material. So yeah, these are some of the projects. So something which many people don't know, I was very involved with Auroville, and I worked very closely with Roger Anger, who was the chief architect. He had given me areas to, I could say he's my kind of teacher around the terms of architecture of the city, and I worked many years. He gave me things to develop, and I was very involved in the city planning. But in Auroville, there is many people do not actually understand or agree maybe that Auroville's project it's called Ville. The idea is to build a city, because it was supposed to be a prototype city that could be replicated by India and the world. But of course, there is a fascination for low density, much more individualistic green single houses. I slowly, after Roger Anger passed away, I felt I also had to move on, kind of, because for me, the city aspect of Auroville is the only way it could be sustainable, because I couldn't justify if such few people occupy such huge amounts of land. I don't know. For me, I'm kind of worrying about whether that kind of model is green enough for India, where land is such a big resource. So anyway, through many of those difficulties, next chapter, I wrote all that book. And I mean, parallel to this, there's been a lot of publications from my side. And I did a lot of public buildings from the town hall complex with very large span roofs. But if you look behind the materials, you see there's a lot of engineering, clever engineering that, that was a guest house. I'm doing very humble buildings as well. This is a library in Pondicherry, some public buildings. This is with ferrocement loss shuttering, urban eco-community housing. This is a latest project which we finished. It's a daycare center for children from very disturbed backgrounds. So yeah, what I'm doing here, one of the things I'm doing for the future is, even though there has been there is a lot of resistance perhaps in Auroville to this city aspect of Auroville, I have been continuing in Europe with other researchers in solving new models of housing, where it's beyond ownership, and so co-housing model basically. And you're in this picture, you see Jan Gale, whom I am trying to incorporate in this discussion. He's I was teaching in Stuttgart. This was produced there. Jan Gale, I'm following him for mobility. He's a known Danish consultant. I'm an architect who has revolutionized pedestrian cities. Here, this is my upcoming publication. I'm trying to write what was intended for Auroville, according to me. And then, yes, the rest of it is just, yeah, I'm just showing you images. This is a thing made all in granite. And finally, my current research is about ferrocement, where I'm trying to cast very thin 2.5 centimeter thick, housing elements by using the shape and form and form work to cast them on paper, on corrugated paper. So you see it can be folded and unfolded, and with very little mesh, you can actually build the house. And there's a prefabricated version of it. It's called Fulfill Homes, where you can assemble them in that way, and also a toilet model. So yeah, I mean, this work that I've been doing, I suppose it's a bit more known outside of India because I've done many exhibitions. This is my second Biennale shown here, 2016, where all this was also full scale. But alongside that, they also showed all the, you see here, there is some kitchen module and all kinds of elements for housing for those who really can afford it. By the way, it takes about a week to build this house. We did tests in Chennai. So yeah, these are all houses which I'm doing for a lot of projects I do are not for clients, because clients are, I think, the typical kind of clients we have in India, they are not so likely to hire me, but I want to keep researching. So my material research is being shown in other places. My ferrocement research, where I'm looking at alternative natural fibers, plus also high-tech fibers, carbon fiber, etc., where I'm working with German engineers, getting all of that tested, working with students, making them believe in the hands-on approach, thinking with the hands, working with recycling, denim. This is in CEPT, for example. So yeah, I'm doing this sort of thing. This is my AA students. Mexico, Segovian, Spain. Building with books, waste books as well, because before they burn them. These are some sofas and things, and a whole canopy roof. This was done for a pavilion in Barcelona. So yeah, there's a lot of engineering. In the end of the day, I'm saying knowledge, building buildings, but actually what you're building is building knowledge and building community while building buildings. This is the way I would summarize my practice. And I would like to end with this drawing, where I feel the profession ahead. This is a drawing I gave Alejandro Aravena when he asked me for my concept for the Venice Biennale. I told him, he said reporting from the front was a topic. And I said, we must invest in knowledge, because knowledge, I mean, the practice for me is the trunk of the tree. It creates synthesis from whatever we find out. Like the roots are finding out, they're on the frontiers of knowledge building. That's where the cells are alive. You're just reaching and digging. And the expression of that is what you see in the diverse expressions that are the different fruits and flowers. But I feel that the profession ahead, which worries me much more than it worried me when I took this type of life, I think I asked myself, after spending so many more resources, are our cities better? Is our architecture prettier? Is anybody happier? Do we have health, well-being? Anything have we achieved more? I am doubtful, and I feel I think my aim with every architectural thing I do is to create spaces where that unmeasurable quality is felt. Where you have a contact to yourself, you have a good contact to your community and others, and you have a total contact to the nature, which is your habitat for humans. So all three of us, on all the three levels, the same human needs to feel well with others, with ourselves, and with the habitat. So it's a question of alignment. And I think there is no shortcut. And I'm going to show how long it took me to, take, sometime in your hastiness, you delay things. So I took the time, but when I look back, 30 years was completely rewarding. And I think I would like to stop with a message: take time, because time is life. Time, we have this notion time is money, but actually time is all we have in our lives. So we should spend this resource well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anupama, for
Thank
that
you.
wonderful presentation and giving a complete overview of your practice and also your academics. We should now throw open the panel discussion with questions. I have a few questions which have come to me. I would like to read them, and we would like to seek answers from both the honorable luminaries. The first question is how the present situation resulted from the virus spread will impact design parameters or building design from virus security angle. That is the question. Architect Vijay Pawar is asking it from Nasik. So can Prem and Anupama answer it?
Anupama, you want to go first?
Okay, thank you. I'll attempt an answer, because how can I be so presumptuous to know how everything is going to happen with COVID? But I can tell you that I feel, because connecting to the talk of Prem when he spoke about uncertainty, I feel that the security and the certainty which we have felt was illusionary. It's not true. Life means uncertain. Truly, if you take away the recent urbanization, post-industrial urbanization, we have always, every day people are like even animals. They don't know where the food is coming from. If they don't hunt, they don't eat. But we've managed a kind of illusionary world. Of course, when it cracks up, we try to balance here, repair there, and all that. For me, what I feel is, if you learn to navigate the uncertainty from beginning, that's what I did in my life. And even though we didn't have COVID, I had many crises on personal level, social level. This is not the first economic crisis. I was in Germany, I was in Spain. We faced several things, different crises keep on coming and going. I think sometimes the crisis, what it does is a favor to you. It takes away some illusion. When tsunami happened, there is a natural disaster type of crisis, and then there is also a human created economic crisis and everything. Are we managing? If there was no COVID, were we happier? COVID is only giving us time to think, na? It's only revealing. So my take on it is, let's take it as a blessing. Let's stay in our house. Let's of course take all the precautions and all that. Let's not fear if some things crumble, because we didn't have the guts to crumble them. So let's take the grace, and just think. And yes, of course, half the anxiety people feel are because they don't know how to live with themselves. When they come home, they can't face, people flee, they need to go shopping. You just make peace with yourself. If you can live with yourself, you will start taking right decisions in your next layer and next layer. And I think for me, it was very interesting, because COVID made me have the same life of the 10 years in all. I already sorted out how to live with myself. So I got even many ideas of resilience for cities. But I think those kind of technical ideas, I don't feel like discussing, because I think we are trying to flee from the problem of being with ourselves. And I would like we deeper feel the problem, and the solution will come on its own. That's my feeling.
Thank you. Prem.
I think rather, we shouldn't just look very specifically at how to combat the virus, because that's really a problem that's going to be there for the next 2 years. I think we need to take a wider perspective. We need to say ask what causes the ground for this kind of a virus to come about, and secondly, what causes it to have a worse impact than it might have. You got to remember the COVID is what's called a zoonotic virus. It's a virus that has jumped from animals to humans, and that is because of the way we are intruding into wildlife. That is because the way we're being destructive about ecology. So I think there's a far greater pressure to look at the ecological impact of what we design. the ecological impacts of urbanization. Is the model of urbanization in a resource-intensive, extractive mode really what we should be doing? Those are questions we have to ask as architects. The second thing is the virus has had a far worse impact than it need to have. Part of it has been because of bad leadership. But the major thing is poor investment in inclusive public health. Now, how does this impact on architecture? There are a couple of issues that are worth looking at. Let's look at the question of density. A lot of people have been saying that density is the problem. It breeds the virus. We need to rethink whether we have cities at all. That is not the case. I mean, there was a lot of talk about density when the virus first started running rampant in the United States because New York was the worst hit. Right? There was a stage at which New York City alone accounted for something like more than 1/3 of the cases in the entire country. And they said New York is more dense than most cities. That's why it has happened. But if you look at cities with comparable density like Hong Kong and Seoul, they didn't suffer the same way New York did. And it's because of two things. One is the kind of public health infrastructure they had, which could respond to the situation. And the other is the degree of citizen engagement they had and the cooperation that citizens showed in fighting the pandemic, such as universal usage of masks, things like that. So density is really not the factor, except, I'll qualify here, it's not the factor when you look at the broad scale of people per square kilometer. But if you look at it at a much finer grain and you say people per square meter, then you find it is a huge factor. That people living in denser conditions are much worse hit. And who are in the denser conditions? The poor. So I think it has brought to light the conditions of inequality in our cities. And those are things we have to think of in the models of urbanization we are following. So I think rather than just looking very specifically at the coronavirus, I think we have to look at these wider questions of ecology, inequity, things like, and public health. You know, what is the public realm? What in our city? What should it consist of? What kind of support infrastructure?
I would like to add one more thing, that those who are underprivileged in India, and by the way, they are the bulk of the people, okay, even when there was no COVID, because I have many friends who live, whom I have also faced myself a lot of living on the edge situation. I think it is so shocking that we go on living, ignoring that reality, that I feel that even if COVID didn't happen, we were not addressing them. My fear is we will not suddenly address if we don't see, because the elite people are facing now some inconveniences. Then they are looking at affordability, or they are looking at economy. The reality of those people pre-COVID, we have to still do that homework, which we didn't do. So I don't believe that COVID will naturally make people do anything. I don't think we can do anything if we don't have the goodwill to notice the state of humanity in a collective level of social gross inequalities and what everyone practices day to day. I deeply believe that if we don't, because I live in Germany and I see how they manage that. I see what the governance does, but you know, the governance is who? It's we, you know, and it's not the governance alone who do that. It's very easy to sit on a chair and whichever government to blame them. But there is an attitude where everyone's profiting from some other people. And that is not that point, I feel. If that doesn't change, I've gone through tsunami, there's that hundreds of crises. Again, opportunists will end up, everybody wants to be patronizing, help whoever, suddenly make new projects, whatever. I deeply believe that there is a human level of sincere addressing of issues which are long overdue, pre-COVID.
Thank you, Prem and Anupama. We'll move to the next question. This is a very different question about the modernization. The AI, artificial intelligence, is the future. How will it affect on architectural education, or how it will affect the practice? So, Prem, if you can elaborate on the practice, and Anupama has an experience in Europe. So, what is happening there in Europe from the AI point of view, she will be able to contribute on that. So, Prem.
I once heard a talk on TED by a neuroscientist called Anil Seth, and he said, we reduce everything to intelligence and we don't think about consciousness. He says we have artificial intelligence, but we can never talk about an artificial consciousness because consciousness is inherently tied to being a living, breathing, emotional being. So I think we need to realize what can be done by intelligence and what cannot. To illustrate, I attended a talk a few months ago before we were in the pandemic by this professor from Wharton, and he has done a lot of research in artificial intelligence. And someone asked him, "Do you think that the future of medicine is only robots for doctors? That we won't have human doctors?" And he said there are a lot of aspects of robotics, a lot of aspects of diagnosis that are better done by a machine, that just because they can pull out larger data sets, more rigorous analytical stuff on the fly. So the machines can be do a lot. But he says there's also an aspect of medicine that's very important, which is about caring. And where care doesn't happen in medicine, medicine suffers. And he says that can never be done by a machine. So that's what I'm saying about consciousness. So I think we need to focus on that aspect of our practice where we can care. I raised the question, for example, who's my friend in my practice? And when I say friend, I don't just mean my colleagues within the practice. I'm saying, who should I consider my friend? Who should I have empathy with? So I think those questions of care will never be taken over by a machine. And those should be the questions that drive practice, not a certain routine of practice that could easily be automated.
Anupam, please.
I mean, I'm so happy to see how much sync there is with Prem. Really, Prem, I loved your answer. You said it so beautifully about consciousness. The fact that intelligence, there is a repetitive aspect of intelligence, like there is a math in it, but that's not really intelligence. The emotional intelligence, which is an intuitive integration, like when we are building something with our hand, when I'm knitting or doing cooking, I'm immediately adjusting something because of the thinking hand. Even the hand is thinking. Thinking is not only in the head. We look at somebody, we shift the way we were going to tell the sentence because you notice what he's comprehending. We are connected, and this is all about if I were to use a machine for washing machine to liberate your time of that's very different from if I outsource my intelligence. When I see in the teaching also, people are drawing things on AutoCAD. So when I see it in a computer, because I know my geometry back and forth by my experiential, integration, they won't see what I see, And like if my child is using the telephone icon, he doesn't know what that handle stands for, my opinion is that if you don't experience, you don't grow intelligent. So I'm also concerned that if we outsource the intelligence and glorify it, then we may be suffering that we are dumber than our grandfathers. We are already. We are less intelligent in many ways. But I am not at all against all this research. I have even taught at IAAC Barcelona, which is all about advanced architecture with robotics and all that. I just feel that if you want to use all that, we have to really match up our consciousness as an individual and collective has to advance to be able to use. It's like you cannot give guns to the children. You have to grow even more advanced that you can judiciously use. You are conscious. If you use consciously all the advances, then what happens? Those are just tools. But when we become the tool of the tool, then it's a disaster. Because it's like you create a monster that is controlling you, and you don't even know because you don't know anymore the difference between what you know and don't know. So, and then you stop becoming a empathic human being who's able to feel something because all you can feel is fear and insecurity. So, but if the human is acting robotic only because everything he's using is digital, is not fine. It's not normal for a human to behave robotic, which they are doing now. That's a problem.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. This artificial intelligence question had come from two people at the same time, architect Vijay Pawar from Nasik and Dr. K.S. Anantakrishna from Bangalore. So they had almost a similar question on this aspect of artificial intelligence. Now we'll move to the next question, which has come. It's a faculty concern actually. It has come from Professor Vilas Vakde from VNIT Nagpur. and also Professor Swami from our own School of Architecture. They are asking that this particular uncertain situation, how will it affect education? How much feasible will be online learning that is happening now? And will there be no physical aspect of learning in studios? Can there be better method? So Prem and Anupama, if you can share your views on this.
I don't think education can shift completely online because education is about lighting a spark within the student. There's one statement that I will never forget. My first job out of college was in Kanvinde Rai Chaudhary, and I was working under Murad Chaudhary. And Murad was also a teacher of architecture. And he said, he was talking to me one day about his teaching experience. And he said something that I will always remember. He said, I can't teach architecture because architecture is not teachable in that sense. But what I can do is I can go into the college and I can communicate my passion for architecture. And if the student gets infected by that passion, that student will learn architecture on their own. So I think that sort of spark of connection is a key aspect of teaching. In fact, I would say pedagogy is far more important than content. And that's how you learn, and that requires the human to human contact, and it's very difficult to do that online. Having said that, I think the online can definitely play a role, and I think, for example, what a group like the Khan Academy, which is doing it more for school education, and the idea of the flipped classroom, where currently we have a model of education where everyone comes to the classroom to hear the lecture, and they're all made to sit in one room and do the same thing. And then they go home to do the homework. So here, all the lectures can be online, and you go home to listen to the lecture, and you come to the classroom to work in groups so that there is also peer learning under faculty guidance, and you work on projects that implement what is in the lecture. So I think those kind of models using a combination of online and physical are what are going to prove the foundation of education. But
it's very interesting,
we in India actually have a very misplaced model. First, we just treat education as vocational, that the idea is to just make the student employable in practice. That's not the idea of education. The idea of education is to stimulate people who will be learners for the rest of their life. And to convey that, the teacher has to have that passion. So the teacher has to be the learner. We operate under the fallacy that the only people coming to learn in the college are the students. We must first create the college where the teachers come to learn. And then that energy should drive student learning.
So teacher need to be a learner first. That is the message Prem is giving. Anupama, you have to say something on this?
Yes, again, agree with him. I was going to tell about the flipped classroom, only that thing, because it was in Australia since 2000. I mean, I'm since 10 years teaching in that module, in that way. And even when I taught in Madrid before Corona, we used to teach online because we had, I mean, not that we taught everything online, exactly how Prem said it without repeating. That is very important to have. For me, learning can only be experiential, no matter what subject it is, and design even more, because we have to embrace, we have to understand, you know, our bodily scale inside all of that. But I was, apart from that, I'm also critical about many educational systems where even when we were sitting face to face, we are not really doing experiential learning. We are giving information for people to reproduce in exams. And it's not as if just because I can be in a conversation sitting with you, not be present, I'm thinking of something else. So then I'm also wasting time. So neither system is guaranteed. Only the thirst of the student is like Prem said, is the only way learning can happen. And I believe that I don't also believe it should be only the teacher's job to motivate people. If you have your own hunger, then only, if you don't breathe in, how the air will go in your lungs? Some people are taking more air and some are taking less by how much they are breathing, you know. And so this is true. But beyond this, because of the flipped classroom approach, where what I do is that all those so-called boring subjects like building services, what students find boring, I'm saying, you know, where they are dodging them, where reading is involved and all that, I think they should be given a bibliography to read and come to discuss. It's not to hear my monologue, they have to come. Those things can be easily read. And I think instead the analog part has to be absolutely deeply experientially shared between the humans who are in the environment of the community of learning, teachers, students alike. And I think I'll tell you two colleges which I love. Okay, one was is the Boston Architecture College, where even beside Harvard and all that, in Boston Architecture College, it is still architecture as a profession. So they feel that if at any given point, at least you have to be having an internship. So suppose you didn't get an internship in that semester, your name is chucked out. You have to show that you have an internship, so that any theory that is being shoved down your throat is being integrated because you work in somebody's office and you learn to work and appreciate on whoever's building, not only starting with my project. And every semester doing just few concepts, reaching some superficial level, again going to another topic to the superficial. But the real design happens when you design the details, and till the end, its designing is going on. And students don't get to experience it. So there are two schools where I experienced this practical part was vibrant and alive, and the academia was they were not relying on that amount of contact learning, because they need to liberate the students' time to be able to actually have an analog experience of much more value. The other one was when in IE Madrid, the dean is Martha Thorne. She is part of Pritzker, so you might know her. I taught there as well. So thanks to them, I got a absolute training on online teaching. They had the state-of-the-art facilities. And the reason their online was being taught is in one semester when you do design problem, so that the student goes to any famous practice, which we position them, they can go and do internships and be away in another country. So we used to initiate the design first 2, 3, 5 weeks, and then they get reviews online after we did the experiential part. So they are actually sitting in an office, and over 10 semesters, they've done at least 5 solid internships, which are selected by the school. So there are many virtues of online teaching. And for example, we wouldn't be talking now, right? I wouldn't be coming. Prem has to come from Bangalore. I have to come from, so there's so much advantage. I think we shouldn't be judgmental. We should remain emotionally intelligent and take everything what we can get.
Yeah, thank you. Students need to be passionate. That is the most important aspect. And it's good that you mentioned about BAC. In fact, just 6 months back, I was at BAC.
Oh, really?
And it was very interesting to go through their school's work. And shortly, we'll be having a connection with BAC from D.Y. Patil University. Yeah.
My favorite.
Yeah. So that's the question. A very strange question is coming up, which is seeking answer for the national level in India, not specifically architecture, but about the building industry. It is coming from architect Rafi from Singapore. And he reports the situation in Singapore now is that the construction industry is hit badly, as much as for 96%. And the GDP fell by about 46% in comparison with the earlier quarter. In one quarter only, it has gone down by 46%. So he is curious to know about how it will impact the building industry. I think Prem will be able to answer it appropriately. And probably the European situation, if you know, you will be able to contribute. Yeah, Prem.
I don't think there's a ready answer to that. As I mentioned in my talk, I don't think there's a normal we will return to. We are changed forever by the way the world has been turned upside down in the last few months.
Yeah.
And so we need to build alliances and reflections and what what the future is. So as an example, we've just started a research project which is looking at the changing nature of the office. And if work from home becomes a regular thing, not that everybody is working from home, but we might not ever go back to the model which says that everybody has to come to office every day. So we might have people using a combination of work from home and work from office. And that completely changes the notion of what an office needs to be. But that's not something an architect can decide on their own. We have to work with psychologists, we have to work with IT people, we have to work with managers, and we have to. So we look at to see how we can build those alliances and brainstorm over these things. So we have to be much more strategic. So the second thing is, I think, this is something beyond the scope of architects, but we need to think about what kind of an economy we create. That our current economy is too resource extractive, too damaging, too alienating, and I think that there's an economist called Kate Raworth who put it well. She said, we have an economy that must grow whether or not we thrive, whereas we need an economy that makes us thrive whether or not it grows. So that is that again, we have to start debating with economists, but that's tied to what kind of a settlement pattern we will create. How do we look at the relationship between work and home? So there are a lot of these deep reflections we have to undertake. So we just have to commit to giving up on the sort of crutches of certainty we were clinging onto, and be willing to wander into the unknown and realize that we need help along the way. So to build the alliances for that help. So no easy answer, I'm afraid, to that question.
True. Very true. Yeah. Anupama, you would like to say something?
Yes, again, I'm talking from a very broad thing, so maybe I'll find my answers too philosophical and not practical, but actually I'm coming also from the practical. My information is coming from there. So I have been writing a lot about, I've recently contributed to a paper in Norman Foster's Foundation, where I have been giving workshop, and so that the thing was called Rethinking Affordability in the Age of Climate Change. So what I have made for the case of India, I've tried to sort of address the fact that we are not a mainstream industrialized nation. We are not yet. We are very industrialized compared to our tradition or where we were just a few years ago. But we are way. The bulk of us are not, and so a lot of the theories that are applied, to the certain corporatization of all those building material products and all those things, are impacting us differently, because if you look at what goes on in the building industry in India, it's still very much, there's a very hybrid production of, like I showed those images, how bricks are made, stone is extracted, this and that. It's all coexisting. The bullock cart is still coexisting with cars. So it would be very opportune moment for India to, while the certain things stop, to, if we proactively strengthen the existing, which have not died out, then those exact people who've returned to their places, they can conduct a more decentralized material production, where there is a decentralized, kind of already ecosystems which are in balance. And actually, if you don't look at the crisis from the point of the few people who will go from riches to rags, if you don't think of them, actually it could be also a great opportunity.
Yeah, so nice.
Also, we have a huge young population. We still have the skills to do things with our hands, like from cooking, stitching, everything we still know. So we will not, if we see that as an opportunity, we could rather fix the way development should be working for India. That's my hope.
Architects are mainly concentrated in urban areas. So there is a question that is coming up from a non-architect. Mr. Avinash Kakade is the registrar of Symbiosis International University in Pune. His concern is, can the opportunities come up for architects in rural development for its infrastructure in the future? So how do we take it up? Prem would be able to answer that, and probably the rural Germany, what is happening exactly related to architecture there, or architectural practice in rural Germany. You will be able to say something on that. So Prem.
I'm sorry, I think my internet connection is a bit wonky. I didn't hear the question.
I will repeat the question again. Can the opportunities come up for architects?
Repeat the question, please. I could not hear it. The sound went off a bit.
Okay. Are you okay now? Can you listen to me?
Yeah, I can hear.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. The question was, can the opportunities come up for architects in rural development or the infrastructural projects in the rural area in future? So what do you feel in the years to come, how the architect can spread into rural areas for the opportunities?
I think architects will have to look at that. I saw one question that was typed on the Q&A, which said that what is your opinion with the number of architects who are graduating every year? And I think that's very much tied to this question, because we are going to be producing 20,000 architects a year entering the market. And the current paradigm of cities and practices will not absorb that many architects. there are just about 1 lakh registered architects with Council of Architecture. So how will 1 lakh, and that's number of registered architects, so the number of practices is far less. So how will they absorb 20,000? So the problem is practices are too concentrated in the metropolitan areas. So, and a lot of the growth and development is going to happen in tier 2, tier 3 cities, small towns, rural areas, and architects have to learn to serve those communities. But having said that, we will also have to start thinking and teaching these things in the college, that the conventional methods of project delivery might not work in those areas. A person in a rural area might not, for example, if they want a house, they might not have the money to spend on that house all at one shot, like a person in a big city would have. So they might say, I can afford to spend this much per year over so many years. So actually, architects have to provide the technical assistance to more self-help incremental housing and learn how to serve that, not the traditional method of project delivery. I think John Turner, in an essay in the 1960s, put it really well, where he said housing is a verb. We tend to describe it as a noun, and we productize it, and therefore we make it unaffordable. But housing is a verb. By people use housing as a way of improving their life over time, and we have to learn to be supportive to that process.
Yeah, Anupama, about the rural scenario in Germany.
But first, remember, I went to the rural area 30 years ago, but not because of the problem, but because I was not happy as an architect. So I can tell all the architects, if you go to the rural area, you are likely to produce better things, because you will not feel like a slave of your corrupted systems, where you feel like the conflict which is external, you make it internal, and then your peace of mind is gone forever. So I would say go to the rural area. You can get healed. In Germany and in Europe in general, rural areas are not seen as something lower of a social gap, or that there are lower facilities. If you go to any village, you will see that it is as developed as any city. It's a density thing. They don't look at a rural place where somebody has not enough access to health or basics, or the infrastructure is less good. It's not like that. So in this context, the migrations still happen due to the similar reasons. But what we have in India is a huge gap between what we are offering the rural and in what we are offering. I, having lived even in Tamil Nadu, in that area, in all the 30 years, the kind of power cut you have compared to Chennai, or any resources where they are prioritized, what is faced on a daily basis by farmers, and there's a huge gap. And I think that's the thing. Until the social gaps are met, all the distorted picture, every survey is wrong, every experience, all those are sitting and deciding, they don't know those realities. So the rural areas should not mean rural and urban, do not, the density issues and what defines rural and urban actually is not, nowhere is it implied that there is a social gap or lack of care given by the government to those places. It's not, if this is something we are mixing a layer in India, in our perception, and that makes some distortion.
I'd just like to add to that we need to think about how we define rural. Census of India has 3 categories: the size of the settlement, the density of the population, and the percentage from non-farm income. If those measurements, all 3 fall under a certain threshold, it's defined as rural. But if you take each of these criteria differently, you get a very different map of the rural compared to taking all 3 of them together. And things are changing. If a village is just touched by a highway, suddenly the percentage of non-farm income rises drastically. So, and things are not so separate. I mean, the rural and the urban penetrate each other. There's a person who might be working to the city but goes back every festival or harvest time to the rural areas. We saw what happened in the migrant population in the cities when the lockdown hit. That's where support structures. That's where not nuances also.
I just want to add, I'm so happy that you brought that, because it reminded me, long ago Anand Patel had done an exhibition here in Berlin and I took part in it. It was called What Makes India Urban, and I had I contributed with a thing called the not yet urban. I didn't call it rural, I called it not yet urban, because what I noticed about peripheries, like look at Gurgaon, look at any peripheral, Haryana, Delhi border, or Pondicherry, Tamil Nadu. And so because in India, the rural areas are not regulated, So they will not even be rural, like Prem said. So any highway, anything comes there, they are just, those are places are in a dark spots in our consciousness. They are ignored areas. So anyone can build anything. You can put up a glass tower. There is no rules even. Neither it's with the panchayat. The panchayats don't know their rights. There is just complete chaos. And so what happens is that we are not, neither our urban areas are remaining urban, nor the rural. They're not fully urban. They're just random gated communities and random skyscrapers, by developers. So no one's working on the urban fabric as an integral thing. And in the rural, we're not protecting it either. So here we have, in Europe, we have a very clear way of distinguishing that and preserving what, or having something of the same attention to those two things. So that is something very important, because we are destroying our rural areas. There we are introducing the bad practices by who got there first.
Okay, thank you very much, Anupama. Sometime back, Anupama, you had written an article that you had shared with me. Freedom from the known. Freedom from the known, imagining the future without the baggage of the past. And there you quoted, production of architecture is greatly influenced by an industrialized building trade. And your concern was about diminishing the role of architects in shaping the built environment. So I think probably Prem also will be able to contribute, because diminishing role of architect in shaping the built environment, he will have the latest ideas about this, what he feels in the profession. So from Anupama, how you take that?
That was one of my favorite pieces that AD had asked me, AD London, to write about my work, and they had done an issue on freedom, and it's about liberation, very nice issue. So my essay, borrowed from the title of Jiddu Krishnamurthy, was Freedom from the Known. I called it because I feel that people are not getting free of their habits, and they're not operating like free people as an architect, and they are part of the mechanism who are creating the problem. But the architects get together and say, oh, how bad is this and how bad is that, and there's no political will and there is no that and this. But my feeling was that if you're in a climate of that type of climate which we are whining about, in that climate, if you don't make yourself free, first of all, then you won't apply your action. You will not apply your knowledge to your action. You will be part of the mechanism. You will say, oh, what can I do, or this and that. And so I wrote that piece, and in that I explained the agency and that if the architect is not free, that was my conclusion paragraph of what you said. But I talked about that neither we are producing, like until Bauhaus times here, people were designing details and they were leading the building industry. Today we are just victims of whatever catalogs land in our desk, and I think we are taking a very passive role. I think there is a lot to say, and I think the reason I felt a bit satisfied in what I'm able to do, what I think an architect should do, is because I had to first and foremost take a huge decision to become very free, to live with no means, so that I never have to do that kind of horrible, shitty job, for someone, that I can, if I need the money, I wait one more month or one more week. I don't need to compromise. So I had to first of all remove myself from those interdependencies, and that's what I wrote in that journey. I like that essay a lot, because they made me bring out something which normally they see the product. They don't see the personal choices you made, that you could allow a process that could lead to that kind of product.
What do you think about the situation, Prem?
I think as far as this notion of the diminishing role of the architect, I think if you believe you had an undiminished role, then you're living in some fantasy land. Architects have never controlled the majority of the built environment. In India, it's less than 10%. But even in the West, the large segments of housing which are just built with stock plans and don't go through the process that we call architecture. So we've always been marginal. I think our problem as a community is that we've tended to blame others and we are unwilling to look at ourselves. And that's because we built a very self-referential culture. And in a way that's I can understand why that's happening, because the bottom line of how we measure ourselves is intangible. If someone asks me where the last 10 years successful of your practice, I will not look at my balance sheet or my profit and loss statement for an answer. I'll think what were the last buildings, the buildings I did in the last 10 years, and were they good or were they bad. Now, you look for some means of social validation beyond that, beyond your own intuitive satisfaction. And so a lot of architects tend to assess their success by saying, well, does my work win design awards? Does it get published in the reputed journals? Is it discussed with respect in the schools of architecture? Does it win competitions? And all these things. And these are valid goals, but when they become the dominant mode of validation, you have to realize they're all peer review judgments. So actually, architects are really designing for other architects, and the constituencies that they are really meant to serve, they don't see them clearly enough. So I think if you're bothered about the role of, about your position as an architect, I think you need to look within and critique yourself and stop whining about the Supreme Court judgment that allows engineers to practice architecture and things like that, because there are too many architects who haven't differentiated themselves from non-architects who produce buildings. And so I think if you invest in work, if you create work that is socially relevant, if you create work which has an aura that's inspiring, that will communicate its own value, whatever you might think about the role of the and position of the architect. And that's what you should pursue. And all that comes from your inner authenticity, not from some external validation. And that's what you should aim at. And this question about the role of an architect and the position of an architect, diminishing role and all that, I don't try to spend time bothering weighing myself down with those kind of questions. I just try to say, am I doing something worthwhile? And I think that's all you should be concerned with.
I do want to clarify what I'm also meaning by that diminishing role is that, see, the architect in the integrated collaborative practice, what makes things realize, there are builders, there are craftsmen, there are users, there's a lot of participation of everyone doing it. But in it, the architect has a role, which I mean is they are doing in a diminished way because of all those fuzzy, things they enter into. I think we can do better inside that role. I do believe that. I'm not saying, I don't mean in the master builder sense at all. You can see my practice, it's not coming from there. But yeah, I do feel that we are not able to access our thinking mind, and we are putting in action much less than our own knowledge and consciousness. This is my feeling. I saw those people in my class, how genius people are there, and why this is not. There are factors behind on a human level, human factors that don't allow us to. These are personal decisions where we are producing less than we are imagining. That I feel is a big loss for the society.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions in question and answer box. It's very difficult to take up all those questions.
I've been giving answers here.
Yeah. Okay, that's nice. To conclude, I would like to put up a last question to both of you, and probably that is lingering in the minds of young architects. What would be your advice to young architects and graduating students to settle down well in profession of architecture? So the question is to both of you, starting with Anupama.
See, what I can say is I think we have to stop bickering about our schools or our parents or whatever we came from. It doesn't matter where you come from. It only matters where you want to go. I'm very grateful to JJ. Whatever we used to complain also those days. You realize that I think we have to take education in our own hands. And we don't have to blame neither our parents or our society or our community, wherever we are in, whichever place we have been born, whichever school we got to go to. That's just a springboard. And in those places also, if we remain more alive, you can take out more from it. And I feel we should keep our life's quality and education as an unending education, the reins in our own hand. And wherever we go, instead of complaining, try to complement, try to know the edge between what you know and you don't know. And whatever you don't know, somebody knows it, or you have to seek it. What action are we going to take if we have curiosity? So I would say, I would ask you all to please empower yourself, and don't think that by going to some education, I've taught in all these good places, everywhere a student can be present or not present. And often when you pay a lot, you act more present. because you're just like we shouldn't learn under pressure. I think if you have a true longing, you can get anything, and I really did not expect to land in any of these places. It's just a huge aspiration and a conviction that I deserve better, and that my purpose of my life is to develop myself. And I want to, as an architect, I think I am my first project. Who will I become? There are thousands of unbuilt projects, but they made me into a different sensitive being. Each project I do, it expands my empathy. It makes me, I don't know, I just can live more present. And I think my aim of my life is to create myself, and that if we do that, you can, everywhere in the world are opportunities to learn from. You only open the eye.
Thank you.
I dealt with that question specifically at some length in a piece I wrote. It's called 9 Lessons for a Young Architect, and it's on my blog on WordPress if you search for it.
Sure.
So it was actually a convocation address at an architecture school that I then wrote up as a paper. But to respond right now, I'd cite, there's a wonderful book by the German poet Rilke. I think it's called Letters to a Young Poet, and it's about his correspondence with a young aspiring poet who's looking for advice. And one of the questions that the poet asks is, how do I write poetry? And Rilke says, you're asking the wrong question. You should ask the question, must I write poetry? And if your spontaneous answer is I must, then the how to will sort itself out over time. And so I think one is the problem with our education system is you are not taught to trust yourself. You're always taught to place your trust in something external. So the first thing is trust yourself. You are your own best site of validation. Whatever you learn, do you feel it? Does it resonate within your body? Does it make you feel more whole? Use that as a way. Like even when you're designing, imagine the sensation of being in the space you're designing with the full emotional, the range of it. And then, so learn to trust your own judgment, but always critique it so that you're not, too self-absorbed. But you have to bring your heart into it. Too many students try to think just with their head. You have to bring your heart into the process also, because if you let your heart lead, the head will eventually follow, almost certainly. But if you let your head lead, your heart may never follow, and you will become less of a person because of that. So I think just trust yourself, live with your heart, with your full sense of being, and always be curious. Look at the world with wonder, not saying I must command it. The world is a beautiful place. It's just waiting to teach you stuff. In fact, I think we should teach students how to wonder. That's our primary job as a teacher. As we have the natural ability as young children. We are always captured by wonder, but we're schooled out of that ability by the education system. So just live in wonder, live with your full sense of being.
Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.
Yes,
yeah.
we have a lot of questions.
Being curious and passionate is the underline that the student should need to know and then proceed in life to be successful, to be well settled in the profession.
The profession is so hard that if you're not in love, you can't get the energy for all the obstacles.
True. Yeah, thank you very, very much, Anupama and Prem, for being with us, giving your precious time and having a nice dialogue with us. We have come to the end of this webinar, and I now hand over control to Neha.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. I believe there are so many questions which actually went unanswered today, and what we'll do is we'll try to seek the answers from our panelists, and we can upload them on our university website after 25th of July. So formally moving towards the closure of the webinar, and a word of thanks. I would like to thank Architect Anupama ma'am and Architect Prem sir for accepting our invitation and for gracing the webinar with their presence. And I'm sure all the participants who are present here today have got wonderful insights on how a great building must begin with the unmeasurable factors and knowledge before action is important for the profession ahead. Thank you for your very interesting and thought-provoking address. I would like to express my sincere gratitude towards our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Dr. Saili Gankar ma'am, our Principal of School of Architecture, Dr. Uma Zadav ma'am, for having faith in us and giving us the opportunity and for providing us with all the possible logistic support towards organizing this webinar. I would also like to thank our head of department, Professor Omkar Samudra sir, and program head, Professor Seemanthini Nakil ma'am, for the unwavering support and guidance for making this event a success. And lastly, I would like to also acknowledge the IT department for taking care of all the technical aspects. With a large number of participants, we truly value your participation and support for this webinar. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for your kind attention and participation. Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Prem. Special thanks.
Yeah, it was great to meet you.